If you were going to pick a single thing to ever test to give you insight into how long you're likely to live, VO2 max would outpredict anything else you could possibly measure. Blood work, blood pressure, scans of any type, nothing will tell you more about your lifespan than VO2 max.
VO2 max, what is it and why should I care?
You should care because one could argue pretty well and pretty strongly from the scientific literature that it is the single largest predictor of how long and how well you're going to live. And so hopefully that caught your attention. I can dive in more detail, but that's it. What I mean by that literally is there have been many studies done from many laboratories over literally 30 years. So I'm not cherry picking kind of one study or exaggerating the effects of a particular scientist who likes it or something like that. I'm really summarizing collective body of evidence that goes back to the late 1980s. It's really that long and that well established. And in many of these studies where you're generally talking about, something like 10 to 20,000 all the way up to 750,000 people. So very large studies, not small studies at all. And where they often measure who dies. So in these particular studies, they follow people until some people die and then they finish the study. So we don't have surrogate markers or predictors or things like you really quite literally. So I like the strength of these studies, seeing who lived and who did not live, and then going and saying, okay, what was associated with those people who lived versus those that didn't and those that had maybe non-death cardiac events, a heart attack or something, but didn't quite die. And then what differentiates all these things that go from death to still things that are not death, but you don't want versus those that are excelling. And in those studies, when you look at blood pressure, cholesterol, heart disease, smoking history, alcohol use, any of these other things that are generally called comorbidities, so things that we know are bad for your health, most of them will predict some variance, is what it's called, of death. So in other words, so smoking will predict, will increase your risk of death by, say, 40% or something like that. Well, none of those clinical risk factors, so things you would get tested at a general doctor's visit, your blood pressure, your body composition, your BMI, things like that. They're all good, super important, but none of them will come even remotely close to predicting who's going to live more than VO2 max will. And usually by a fold of, say, 3 to 6, meaning VO2 max will predict somewhere between 3 to 6 times more of that variance. So it's a really, really, really big deal. We can certainly talk as much detail about those studies or more, what it is and all that stuff, but I wanted to really make sure I answered the question, and why do you even care about this topic, and why are you going to continue to listen the next hour or so of our conversation? It's that. And so if you were going to pick a single thing to ever test, and I literally mean a single thing, to give you insight into how long you're likely to live outside of accidents like a car accident or something like that, VO2 max would outpredict anything else you could possibly measure. Blood work, blood pressure, scans of any type, nothing will tell you more about your lifespan than VO2 max.
I think you got everyone's attention. And so in layman's terms, what is VO2 max?
Well, the term itself, V, stands for volume, O2 is oxygen, and max is maximum. So it is quite literally the maximum amount of volume you can bring in and utilize. What's that functionally mean? You can think about it in two parts. One part is what we'll call central, and the other is peripheral. So central is really referring to your pulmonary system, so your lungs, and your heart itself. The peripheral part is really muscle. And so what we're saying is, how much oxygen can you bring in? Right? This is based on your lungs and your breath rate and things like that. How much of that oxygen then gets into blood, and how much of that blood can you distribute? So there you go. There's the pulmonary side and the cardiovascular side. And then once it's out into your tissue, you have to be able to get that oxygen from the blood into working muscle to do anything about it. And that's the second or peripheral side of the equation. So we're looking at everything, and this is one of the reasons, honestly, why it is such a ubiquitous and robust predictor of life. It's not just looking at one system or one organ. It is looking at lung. It is looking at heart. It is looking at blood. It is looking at mitochondrial health and tissue. It is looking at joint health in a much smaller area. But if you can't move, you can't do these things all the way up and down. And so it is literally going to tell you, can you bring in and use energy? Because once you don't produce cellular energy, nothing stays alive. So in the simplest version, we could talk as much chemistry or physiology or mathematics in the equation if you like, but that's what it's really telling you. How well can you bring in and utilize oxygen? And that's really important because when people tend to hear things like that, their mind often drifts into sport performance. I don't really care about my maximum. I'm not an athlete. I'm not competing. And what I'm trying to explain to you in these first 4 minutes here is you absolutely do. Because even if you never want to compete in a sport again the rest of your life, this is still going to tell you with large amount of accuracy how long and how well you're going to live because of the following. There are certain metrics you cannot get below. And for men, that tends to be about 18 milliliters per kilogram per minute. That's the number, roughly. For women, it tends to be about 15 or 16 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Once you dip below those, we call those the line of independence. Meaning if your VO2 max is lower than that, you have a very hard time living independently. Because basic, what we call activities of daily living, groceries, putting your clothing on, taking a shower, making your bed, those require a VO2 output of somewhere between 10 and 15. And so if functioning activities of daily living is making you go at 90 or 95 or 100% of your VO2 max, you clearly cannot function well. And so while you're not worried about sports and things like that, if you are so low on this list, and number one, you're below that line of independence, it's very challenging to live by yourself. And I don't think anybody would consider that to be the highest quality life that they'd envision if they can't put their own clothing on without being at 70% of their VO2 max, right? The second one is, even if you are slightly above that line, let's say you're much higher than that. Let's say you're at 25. And you're like, oh, fine, I'm not below the list. I don't need to care about this anymore. Well, you do for two reasons. One of them is, if anything bad happens, you sprain an ankle, you get a really bad, say, long COVID, and now all of a sudden you're either in bed for a long time, your physical activity is reduced, your cardiorespiratory system is attacked a little bit, and now you fall below that line. You didn't have any buffer, right? So you were just slightly above it, but one little bad thing happened, and now you fell below it, and life gets really, really hard. I don't think anybody wants to walk through life exhausted all the time. Well, if you're running around just picking up your kids and doing your errands, and you're doing, and that activity represents 85% of your VO2 max, this will manifest itself not just in acute fatigue, but you'll be burning so much physical energy, you're going to be very sleepy. Your energy is going to be extremely low. Your immune system is going to be compromised because you're running gas all day long. Then you're wondering why you don't feel like exercising, you don't feel like doing any of these things. And so just being slightly above those lines is still really problematic for a lot of people. And we have, an executive coaching program called Rapid Health and Performance, and we have seen this countless times. People come in with low energy, fatigue, insomnia, blah, 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 and they don't think it has anything to do with their physical fitness. They're convinced they have a micronutrient deficiency or a pathology in their gut, and like those things can happen. But a lot of times it's like, wow, you're just super unfit. And like they just will not accept that as an answer, but they'll do it. And then their VO2 max goes up and they're like, I can't believe it. Like all these problems in my physical health have gone away or significantly been reduced. I just never thought it was my VO2 max, my fitness. Like I just thought that was like looking good and sports and stuff. And they just really don't connect it to how they're looking and feeling. And most importantly, feeling every single day. So I know I went on a bit of a rant there, but I could keep going. There's even more to say about this, but hopefully that's the context, because I know I've dealt with this battle so many times over the years of people just sort of jumping into like, oh yeah, you just work with the athletes and like this stuff isn't for me. And I really, really need to make sure that this is one of the most important metrics. I would say I'll end on this one here. In our rapid program, we're 95% non-professional athletes in there. And this is one of the central metrics we pay attention to. And we've had huge success in changing things that people, brain fog, concentration issues, sexual dysfunction issues. We've so many times the core driver, not the only thing, but one of the core drivers is their fitness is just really, really low. And if you can't bring in and utilize oxygen, none of your physiology works. So we don't have to be the highest possible. But if you look at the research, going from just the lowest category to second lowest, what we typically will call this is most severe to still below average is typically a 50% reduction in risk. So the most benefit you'll get is just going from that bottom category to second bottom category. So I don't want to make people think, oh my God, I have to, be running a 4-minute mile to get any of these benefits. No, just don't be the bottom. Just don't be the worst possible category, and you'll see huge changes.
So lots to unpack there. Does VO2 max decline with age, or is it more of a function of deterioration due to inactivity, exercising less, or is it both?
It's both. We actually did a study years ago in 80 plus year olds, and we separated into two categories. This is what we call lifelong exercisers. And one of the primary things we were measuring was VO2 max. And so we looked at all 80 plus year olds, including a handful of even 90 plus year olds. And we compared those who don't formally exercise, but were still above that line of independence. So the cutoff here was you're pretty healthy. You're 86 years old. You're living by yourself. You're not formally working out, but you're in a pretty good spot. Okay. And we compared those to people that are age matched, but were still competing in sports. In this particular case, we did it in Stockholm, Sweden. So these were all cross-country skiers. All right. So you have 90-year-olds who are still signing up for races and competing in cross-country skiing and all that. And their VO2 max was about double the other group. Now, what we also know is that exercise group was probably double where they were when they're earlier in their life. So it will decline with age to about 1% per year or so, 10% per decade, kind of depending on how you want to slice that. But we also do know it is extraordinarily preventable, that decline. You'll never see somebody who's, to give you a little bit of context and numbers, I realize I've thrown these out here, but you kind of think about VO2 max as like a scale of 0 to 100. The highest VO2 max ever recorded is about 100. We talked about being below 15 is really problematic. The average person is right in the middle of that bell curve, 40 or so-ish, 35 or so-ish for a female, depending on your age. So you can kind of think about that. If you're above 50, you're actually above the average, which is pretty good. 60s and 70s, you're either really, really fit, really, really high up. So that's kind of calibrating you to the numbers we're discussing here. So what I mean by that is if you were at a VO2 max of 75 when you were a 25-year-old because you were doing triathlons and you were just really competing, you'll never be that. You won't maintain that your whole life. There's just no chance. But you can massively reduce how far it comes off by physical exercise. And there is a lot of research from my lab and others on twins. These are, I'm specifically referring to as monozygous twins. So these are twins with the exact same DNA. So you can control for DNA, but they have different exercise habits. And from those data, it is very clear what I'm saying is true. Your genetics will determine some of it, but your activity and lifestyle has the biggest ability to move that number than anything else. So you have real tremendous control over your VO2 max.
And so how does one measure it? I think what's exciting right now, Aura rolled out VO2 max. I don't know how accurate it is, but it's something. So that's one way someone could measure it. I'm curious your take on Aura and other, the low tech and the Rolls Royce versions of measuring VO2 max, if you will.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that way because that's how I like to do it. This is a simple answer. It depends on how much you care about the details. There's simply no way a device like an Aura can get you the same level of accuracy as going into a laboratory and getting all of your gas collected in a mask on a $40,000 machine. But there's no criticism of Aura, right? Like, you have to be realistic with your expectations here. All these are options, and I really do like the way that you positioned it, because what I like to do is let you know the options and you choose where it's at. We were talking before we started going about, years ago, myself and Phil White and Brian McKenzie wrote a book on fitness technologies. And that was our core argument here. So it's not to say that these things are bad or whatever. It's just you have to understand the limitations you're doing. So I don't know the Aura data specifically. What I can tell you is I have been asked, I have to word this carefully, to help out with other very large companies trying to do a similar thing. And I have not seen one who knows what they're doing. They know what they're doing on the side of technology and software for sure, but they do not get exercise physiology. And so Aura may have not had that problem. I have no idea, but a very little faith in these people. is the way that I'll put it. So here you go. Everything from cheap to the gold standard. This is what it looks like. We'll go in reverse order. Gold standard is you have got to go into a laboratory, into a facility, a research laboratory, or a pay-for-service one that will allow you to be on a metabolic cart. This is where they're going to put some sort of mask on your face. They're going to collect all the gases that come out of your mouth, and they can analyze it that way. Now, the cool part about it is it's actually not that expensive anymore to do so. They're popping up all over the place, especially in America, and the UK and Australia and Germany. They're getting really, really popular. Japan, typically somewhere between $75 to $200. Like, again, which may be totally unaffordable for some people. I get it, but also I think reasonable is a fair word choice there. You want to probably, if you can, a little word of advice there, try to go to some place, if you can, into a research facility, a university, a lab, rather than say a local gym. The local gyms, they always calibrate their machines, and they're using sort of cheaper ones, things like that. So again, just think through that a little bit. A research facility that's done this at the highest standards for publication is probably going to do a better job than the one. Maybe a little more expensive, maybe also be harder to find. So if you can't get that gold standard, then maybe come down to the second standard, which is doing it at a fitness center or longevity clinic or any of these things that are popping up, okay? Then from there, you can step down a little bit to saying, all right, what about my wearable or my tracker? Okay, they're probably going to be reasonably close. Where they tend to start struggling is when they get to the high end of the spectrum. Your actual true max numbers, which you may not care about. You just want to get a rough idea. If are you 25 or are you 60? You want to get in the ballpark. Okay, that's probably good. I mean, you can imagine if they're 10% off, and your ring told you scored 25 and you really scored 27. All right,
So you're still going to want to do better, and that's helpful.
Totally. Okay, so there. Now, let's go one step further. What if I have a bad knee or an Achilles or foot, or I can't run or things like that? What do? Well, there's also what are called submaximal tests. And there are countless of these. There are prediction equations. This is how Aura is working, guaranteed, right? So these are typically like 2 to 10 minutes long, and you don't even go all the way up to a max. You can run, you can cycle, you can swim, you can use a rower. There are literally dozens, if not hundreds, of predictions equations based on whatever mode of exercise you can do. And these are all been scientifically validated. So there's so many I can't even list them, but if you Google them up there. So you pick the exercise mode that you are the most comfortable in and that you do the most. If you're a swimmer, do the swimming one. If you're a rower, do the rowing one. If you don't know, probably start on a cycling bike. Okay, now they're all not going to be the same. The less muscle you use, like on cycling, the lower the number is going to be relative to running, relative to upper body. But if you're a cyclist, you'll score better on cycling because of specificity. Okay, so pick what's there. And if you can do all the way up to a true max, great, that's best. If you can't, though, choose one of the sub-max ones. The sub-max ones typically look like, the most classic one is a 2-minute step test. Okay, you take your heart rate, you step up and down on a very small box, it's like 18 inches. And then you do it for 2 minutes long, and you do it on a metronome, right? So it's like a very specific timing, so you're not going super fast or super slow. And then you check your heart rate at the end of it. You plug in those numbers, and it will predict your actual thing. So you're literally talking, can you step up and down on an 18-inch box for 2 minutes and check your heart rate? Great. Again, I don't know the Aura data specifically, but I have to imagine, you said it was like a 6-minute walking test or something, right?
Yeah, I haven't done it yet, but that's what it looks like.
That's what it's going to be, right? So again, if they use the right prediction equation, some of them are much better than other ones. It's been my experience that they don't. If they reasonably selected that, then you can get a rough estimate there. So if you really want to know your number, though, like an estimate test is always, it's an estimate test. It's validated, but it's not perfect. So depending on what you or how much you care, hopefully that was helpful. There are equations that are different for male and female. So just, again, plug that stuff in. And there are prediction equations and estimates and reference ranges based on age as well. So you should be able to pretty much dial in based on, sex as well as your age and other factors, and pretty much know exactly how you're doing, what percentile you're in, bottom 10, middle, high, etc. Good, bad, elite, world record. So VO2 max is nice because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there's so much data on it that there's a ton of things you can look up and find. And so it's really easy for people to get these numbers. Where you compare this to sort of other things, they don't have as many normative databases and standardizations, things like that. But VO2 max is super robust like that.
We'll definitely link to the chart showing age range, male, female, and where people stack in the show notes. So is it my understanding of HRV, for example, is you kind of have your baseline, you can improve it, but there's only so far you'll be able to go. Is VO max different in that, let's say, for example, my VO2 max is 35. Can I double it? Can I get it to 70? Whereas my HRV, there's only so much you can maybe do.
Well, we can talk about HRE if you like, but I'll start with the VO2 max. It is highly plastic. You will find plenty of people who will get that much success over the course of 1 to 2 years of training. Right now, obviously, the more trained you are, the slower your progression of increase. That's pretty standard. But yeah, you can absolutely see large increases in 8 to 10 weeks. If you want to expand that and really think about VO2 max over the course of a year or two. Now, if you were at 35, would you double to 70? No, probably not. But if you were at 20, could you double to 40? Definitely. 100%. That can happen. We've seen things like that. Probably fairly realistic though. If you're 25 and you can get to 35 in a year, that's good. I'll tell you though, personally, you can definitely get to 35 way faster than a year. Right? So I'm being a little bit conservative there, but you can see really big changes really quickly. I'm talking the first 4 weeks, you'll see changes. Your rate of increase will slow down after that, but you will see big jumps in the first 6 to 8 weeks. And then really, if you can expand your horizon to 6 months and in a couple of years, you will see massive changes. You can 100%, I'll put it this way, go from the lowest category possible, most severe, to above average or even high, maybe not elite. You can certainly go to high within a year. And you can go up a category within a few months, no doubt.
And in terms of getting there, we could talk zones. Is it zone 1 or zone 4? How much time do we need to spend if we're looking at zones? Or is it, if I'm thinking, walking versus rucking versus sprints versus jogging? How do you think about all the different ways one can get there?
I will give you some specific examples just because I know it's easier and I like to hear that when I'm listening to podcasts. But I do need to make sure it's really clear. There is no specific and direct answer here. There really is not. There is not one zone that is magical. I promise you. There's not one method that is magical. And I'm saying that to not hopefully confuse you, but to liberate. If you hate a particular style of training, there's not a single style of training you ever have to do to improve your VO2 max. If you hate running, you never have to run a step in your life.
I love it. I hate running. I'll just start right there. I hate running.
Great. You don't have to run a step to improve your VO2 max, right? So I will, again, give examples, but they need to be reminded and thought of as examples, not direct specifications, and certainly not saying nothing else outside of this works. Okay, so the exercise mode is pretty, I don't want to say irrelevant, but it's unlimited. You mentioned rucking. Great. Swimming. Sure. Walking. Great. Sprinting. Pushing a sled. CrossFit. Great. Kettlebells. Spin class. Yes, 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 yes. Scientific evidence on all of it. It's because that's not the thing that matters. If we're trying to improve your ability to bring in and utilize oxygen, all we have to do is follow one physiological principle called the SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demand. You impose a demand and you get an adaptation that is specific to that demand. Okay? It is the example of if I asked a really simple question and I said, all right, Jay, you want to get better at shooting free throws, you wouldn't be like, okay, what zone should I be in? Should I have my left foot? You would shoot a free throw. Nothing is better at improving VO2 max than challenging VO2 max. It does not matter how you do it, right? Do something that puts you at or close to your VO2 max, and there you go. Specificity tells us that's the most direct route to improving VO2 max, okay? What's the protocol? Doesn't matter. 30 on, 30 off. 2 minutes on, 6 minutes on. That doesn't matter at all, as long as you challenge VO2 max. Okay. That's specificity. You pick your exercise method, you pick the protocol, the interval, whatever you want to do, and we've at least packaged specificity.
Jason Walkup here, founder and co-CEO of mindbodygreen and the host of the mindbodygreen podcast. Please subscribe. You'll never miss a show and you won't regret it. And so when you say challenging VO2 max, just to clarify, that essentially is the feeling of being out of breath.
I wouldn't want to say it that way per se, because that's not always the perception of feeling. Like if you do a VO2 max, we'll always ask, why did you quit? And some people will say, I couldn't catch my breath. Some people will say, heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. Some people don't say that at all. And they're like, my legs were burning so bad I couldn't take another step. So sometimes it's not just breath related. Sometimes it is accumulative fatigue buildup. Sometimes it's, I was getting lightheaded. So there's different ways people experience it. So I wouldn't want to call it only related to breath. If you want to think of a cruder example is, are you at or close to heart rate max?
So that's something tangible. I'm wearing my Whoop. Like if I'm working out, the heart rate just goes to zone. Was it zone 5?
Well, it doesn't matter the zone because it depends on the wearable. What you want to care about is the number. What's the highest number you see, right? And if you're like looking at your watch, you're like, man, this is the worst fatigue I've ever felt in my life, and I'm at 185 beats. Now you know, like you can track your work. Look, what's the highest number you ever see? Let's call that your heart rate max. Then that's your 100, right? So everything else is based on that. So one thing that I strongly dislike is zones, especially from wearables. Like it's just not telling you the information. And especially if you've never had a heart rate max test done, all those zones are totally fabricated. They're 100% made up, right? And it's fine as a rough idea, but they're not specific to you. Like they mean nothing. Since we're here, let me clarify heart rate max really quickly. Heart rate max, the easy adage that you use to calculate this is 220 minus your age. So if you're 50 years old, 220 minus 50 means 170. So as a rough starting place, you can predict your maximum heart rate would be 170 beats per minute. However, I can tell you bluntly, you might be 150 and you might be in great shape. You might be 200. I'm still over 200. Like I'm still way over 200. It's not an indicator of being fit or more fit. It is just the anatomical properties of your heart. It is it's a handful of things that go into it, right? But even that, like okay, so I'm supposed to be 170, mine's actually 200, and you and I are the same age, like I'm making this up, and yours is 150, your VO2 max is higher than mine. But like now all of our zones are based on 50 beats per minute difference. Like our zones are going to be the same on the wearable, but they're in reality, I'm in zone 4 and you're in zone 1. Like we'd be totally screwed, right? Like it'd be opposite, but you get the point, right? Well, those things don't matter. Like I wouldn't do that. You need to figure out your maximum heart rate, okay? Or really, really close. And that is the place to start. So if you get back to that feeling or that actual number, and I'm not saying literally that number, I'm just saying ish. So if your highest number you see on your thing is 170 and you're doing a workout and you're 168, okay, we're going to call that max. Like it's close, right? It is close. That would be a max. That takes care of specificity. Okay. That said, when's the last time you did a legitimate heart rate max workout?
I got to go back in memory lane.
It's hard, right? Like
1998. Last college basketball game I played.
Right. You can't do that every day. And certainly not if you're like older than 25, right? Like you don't have the juice. Like trust me. So my podcast came out yesterday. I had a crazy day. One of my athletes got a major foot infection, had to pull out of a major championship in golf. The exact same day, another one of my athletes got called in to headline a major UFC event on a couple weeks. No, like yesterday was total pandemonium for me. I still had I opened champagne to celebrate a thing. And of course, my kids got up an hour early this morning. So I'm like, if I had to try to do a VO2 max workout today, it's going to be like terrible. Like it's just not going to go well. So it's not realistic to be like, oh, okay, I want to improve my VO2 max. I will do a heart rate max workout every day. And it's not even advisable. It's not even the best way. So there's realistic and there's also, all right, great. But on the surface, if once a week you can do something that gets you at or close to that maximum heart rate, You've checked off that box. Now we have to talk about the rest of your training, because I will not advocate. Again, I said specificity was the best way, but you can't do it every single day. You can't do it physiologically, and then you definitely can't do it, most people, realistically. It's hard, like getting into your workout and being like, all right, I got 25 minutes, and you're just like, okay, I have to do this 20-minute workout that I'm going to throw up afterwards. And I'm mentally, you can't get yourself into doing that every day. Well, I can't. So many people, it's just it's a tall order. But we foundation it on that. We have to do something generally. We're best served if we do something that is going to get us there once a week. Depending on some cases, I might advocate for once every other week, which is 2 times a month. Can you give me 2 times a month where we're going to go after it, right? Sometimes that's okay. It's enough. And now we start filling in the other 2 categories, which are, can we do something that is sustained work at a much lower intensity? You want to call this zone 2, 2.5, like I don't really care at all. I actually use, I don't use heart rate zones like that. I use what Brian McKenzie and his team, they've collectively developed over time, called the gear system, which is breathing gears. And so for this one, I basically say, do whatever you want, as long as you're breathing only in your nose, right? If you can breathe in and out your nose, I know you're going to be at a lower intensity, and that'll be enough. And that is a much better way to use it. So we'll do that. A couple of days a week, can you give me something where you're only breathing through your nose and you're not going to be taking breaks? We do everything from rucking here if you want, no problem. You can cycle easy. A lot of times we'll do like a little 30-minute circuit or 20-minute circuit where like 10 minutes on the treadmill, 10 minutes on the bike, 10 minutes on the assault bike. So you're kind of like having, so if those people that like hate cardio, you're like, okay, let's give me 6 minutes on this one, 6 minutes on this one, 6 minutes on the rower. You get your 25 minutes in, all through the nose only. I'll do this oftentimes in the sauna. So lower the temperature a little bit, don't make it quite so hot. And this is another thing Brian McKenzie taught me. And just move a little bit. Just air squats, stand up, some stretching, some moving around, and you just keep moving a tiny bit at a much lower temperature. So you're not pegging this thing at 200 plus anymore. But lower the temperature and just move for a little bit. 20 minutes. You get the idea. You have options there, right? Like some of our fighters will shadow box or hit the heavy bag in the garage, just moving whatever you want to do. 20 to 40 minutes, depending on your fitness level. I want to see that twice a week.
And so essentially that's pushing yourself, but you're nasal breathing.
You don't have to push yourself, to be honest. Right? Because it's not going to feel that bad. This would be more of I got some work done, but you oftentimes feel better afterwards. When you finish a heart rate max workout, like you never feel better in that moment. Right? You're feeling significantly worse. You might feel better like mentally afterwards, an hour later or something, but you're not. These ones you'll often walk out with like more energy. You're like, okay, I feel great. Like soreness, tightness kind of locked out of there. It is a restorative, lower intensity thing. You might break a sweat, but you're not like, like doing your best to like try to stay alive there. Sometimes we will cap the breath rate. Has to be a 3-second inhale, has to be a 3-second exhale. Something like that, right? So these are like you're working, right? You're bam, bam.
So this wouldn't be a leisurely, I'm a big walker, so I'll use that as an example. This wouldn't be a leisurely walk. This would be a fast-paced walk, or I'm rucking. Like it wouldn't just be I'm strolling down the street. I'm going fast, or I'm putting weight on my back.
Yeah, that'd be good. You could think of it that way. Like this is, if you're going for a walk, I tend to call that physical activity. You're moving, you're being a good human. This is exercise. This is structured exercise. You're not going to do this in your business gear. Like you're going to have to change clothes, right? Like you're going to be moving a little bit here. Doesn't mean again you're drenched in sweat or you're really out of breath, but this is the other one. The third thing I mentioned is that bottom category. This is just now your physical activity. So now this is, I want you walking 20 minutes a day, right? This can be whatever. This can be 2 10-minute walks. This is the true, very, 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 this is a standing desk. This is, can you pace a little bit? And that is this is like an everyday thing. This is 6 days a week, minimum 7 days a week. We got to be moving a little bit throughout the day. So I said that here to like help differentiate the second one from this one. Like that is that baseline physical activity. We do baseline physical activity every day. At least 2 days a week, we do that higher level structured exercise, but still like pretty moderate to low. And then at least 1 day a week, we go all the way up to the top. So that is kind of our cornerstone for VO2 max.
And for going all the way up to the top, I'm assuming that could be an all-out sprint. But here's the question: can you just do the sprint and then you're done, or you do the sprint and then you walk all the way back, then go again? Like, how much do you have to push yourself in that all-out? And I think for people who maybe didn't play competitive sports or athletes, the concept of what this feels like is maybe foreign. I have nightmares about this concept. Unfortunately, I know what it feels like, but maybe describe, like, get a little bit more detailed about what that would look like for someone who's maybe unfamiliar with it.
Okay, so these protocols can look anything all the way down to, say, 20 seconds of maximum work and 20 to 40 seconds of rest, repeated 10 or 20 times. It can go up to more classic ones, kind of what you mentioned, is we start to get to high intensity intervals. You start to get to things that are called fartleks. You get to things like 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, right? This could be sprint the straightaways, walk the corners, like on a track kind of thing, right? It could go all the way up to mile repeats. So distance athletes are really, really famous for, you run a mile, not as hard and as fast as you can, but pretty close. However long that takes you, you take that same amount of rest off, and then you repeat that, right? So you imagine it takes you, maybe you don't do a full mile, maybe you do 800 meters, and that takes you 3 minutes. Then you take 3 minutes off, and then you do that 800 meters again. And you might do that 4 times, right? 3 rounds or 4 rounds, things like that. So you can kind of run from really, really short max bursts up to a little bit longer duration, even 5, 6, 8 minute intervals, okay? Now, the key though is, remember what we're trying to do. You have to stress close-ish to maximum. So if you're going to do like a 30-second burst and you're going to go at 80%, you didn't go very long, you took a break, and you didn't go very hard. We didn't really hit any of the 3 things. It is fine if like you'll feel more energy that day. If you just need to move a little bit, you'll get a sweat going, you'll burn calories. I don't want people to hear that and think, okay, that workout is useless. It doesn't do anything. It does, but it wouldn't be as good as a way to increase your VO2 max because you really didn't challenge. There was no imposed demand. You just made a system that's already capable of handling something. You kept it up there. Be fine for maintenance. Be fine to keep you going. I'll be totally candid. I'll do things like that when I'm traveling a little bit. When I'm smoked, I'm just like, all right, let's just kind of move through a little bit. I don't have it in me to go all the way up to the top, but I'll kind of get 80, 85% there. Like, okay, I feel better. And like, you kind of go through the motion. So it's okay, but you got to touch that red line-ish occasionally. In terms of learning what that feels like, if you don't know what it feels like, it's okay. Just pay attention to that heart rate number and see. And maybe you think you're at a max, and then 6 weeks in or 8 weeks in, you have that one day where you're fired up and you have more energy, push harder, you realize there was 10 more beats there. Like, oh shoot, what I thought was a max was really just 90%. Now you will start to get calibrated.
And so for clarity, for so many people wear wearables that they can track heart rate, everyone can figure out what that number more or less is. How many times should they touch that number in this workout?
I wouldn't worry about it. That's a great question. I wouldn't worry about that. As long as you get it to once, that's great. But the goal here, to be really clear, is to get up to a max every interval. That's the whole point, right? So if you're going to do 4 rounds, 30 seconds as hard as you can, 30 seconds a break, and you can do 4 times that. By the way, there's data even showing getting up to a max for 30 seconds, taking a 3 or 4 minute break and doing it again, that can work too, right? So there's no magic. 30-30 is not magical. You kind of do what you want, but they only work if you get to that top every one of the rounds. That's why I wanted to draw that distinction. So if you're like 30 seconds is over and you feel like to get the next 30 seconds, you're like just barely crawling and you're barely getting the equipment to move, maybe you should actually stop, recover more, but then you got to come back and you got to go back up to the top. But sometimes that's actually a win because you're only actually out 70%, and then you end up being like 70 or 80% the whole time, and you didn't really get what we were looking for here. So yeah, getting to the top every or most of the intervals after you warm up. And I oftentimes will do like one interval at like 70, well, more like 80, 85 or 90 before I like really go to the top. You're like, okay, I'm out of breath. That hurt. But now like, all right, now it's time to like go to the next one. You wouldn't want to go to probably your heart rate max, like interval 1. Sometimes it's hard to actually physically do. But yeah, the point would be to try to get up there as much as you can, because what you're trying to do is red line, come back down. Red line, come back down. Not just kind of like up and down a little bit. You want to get up to the top. So great question. I very rarely have got asked that question. So well done.
Thank you. So one practical way I'm thinking about this is if you have access to a track, you sprint the first quarter, you sprint the first lap, you go all out, then you walk the next one, and then sprint again, walk, sprint, walk, and you do that 4 times essentially, which is going to be somewhat time efficient, I feel like.
Super time efficient, and you're going to cover a mile.
Yeah. But if you do that, you're good. If you do that on off, you're good.
Yeah. You walk a whole lap. That's going to take most people 90 seconds or so. Or sorry, to sprint the whole lap, depending on your fitness. It's like a reasonable number. Okay, that's a minute and a half. Probably going to take you 3 minutes to walk it, right? So now you're 4.5 minutes in. Okay, great. You do 4 rounds of that. That's a 16, call it a 20-minute workout. Pretty good.
We solved everyone's problem. Everyone, we're there.
Yeah, it's a really classic. It's a super common one. I will need to say, if you don't run or haven't run in 20 years, don't go do that workout.
I haven't run.
Start on a bike, do the same thing on a bike or something else, because we're just losing too many Achilles right now.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it's a lot of, it's these things. Honestly, this is a big part of it. You get so fired up, like, okay, I'm in. And then I go from 0 to, 4 laps at a maximum sprint. And like, you haven't sprinted in 22 years. And now you're going to do 4 laps of that. Like,
it's why I'm very early in my rucking journey, but it's why I like rucking in that you're walking, you're just adding. And if you have kids, at one point you've been rucking with children, you're carrying your kids, and it's just, I'm just putting weight on my back, and maybe you won't get to all out exertion, but you're going to get if you're walking at a fast pace with some real weight in your back, you're going to go a long way.
Yeah, totally. One thing I'll say here for people is, if we've got you fired up, hopefully we did, to do some of these things, the biggest mistake you can make in your fitness, VO2 max or otherwise, is getting hurt.
Yes.
Like literally, if you actually look at one of the biggest predictors of VO2 max over time, is people who had the least amount of disturbances in training. Don't get big injuries. Okay. So what I'm saying this is to say, progress slowly, like way slower than you think. Do not do I did a mile this week, I'll do 2 miles next week. Going good, I feel fine. Let's go 3 miles this week. You're doubling your volume or going a 50% increase every single week. That's only going to last 4 or 5 weeks. And it will be week 6 when you get hurt. Because you won't feel it week 1 or 2 or 3, right? But you're laying the foundation of going, hey, we're not used to this thing. So progress way slower. Do not get hurt. I would think about this on a 40 to 50 year time scale, right? If you're 40 years old, you got another 60 to 80 years of exercise, most likely, right? By the time you get to be 160 years from now, life expectancy will probably be 120, not 100, right? With technology. So you're a third of the way there. If you're breaking down physically constantly already, you're not doing your 95-year-old self a very good service. You're definitely not going to do your 65-year-old self a good service. So think about this long term. So what I want people to think about is, like, you want to improve this VO2 max, but you got 10 years to do it. So year 1 is all walking. I'm being extreme, but you get the point. Don't even walk or go past walking for a year. Screw all the heart rate max. We're going to walk. Okay, great. Now our ankles, our hips, our knees, our backs have gotten used to what we call tissue tolerance. It's gotten used to the pounding because it hasn't had that in 35 years. Okay, great. Now year 2, I'll incorporate 1 day a week of light jogging for a mile. Again, I'm being like overly dramatic here, but you get the point. And if you do that, I promise you, by the time you get to year 5, you could do as much hard sprinting as you want and you will never get hurt. But if you do that whole compressed 5-year cycle into 5 days, well, what do you think is going to happen here? So really think about this big picture, and don't dose like, okay, week 1, I'll do this. Week 2, I'll do this. Like, no. Think about this on the many, many months, quarter one of this year, and then quarter two, I'll add something else in quarter three. And think about that. And that's super conservative. I realize that, but you blow an Achilles, you're going to miss a year of training. And this is not, it's not a good thing. So
Very, very sage advice. I want to bring it back to HRV because, I mentioned that HRV may be something that you could improve, but not to the degree you can improve your VO2 max. So is that true? And is there any relation between HRV and VO2 max?
they are related. Absolutely. But it's a Venn diagram there. And depending on the person, that is a stronger or weaker correlation. There is some data to suggest HRV is generally correlated with overall health. And it's good enough. There's actually a lot on physical health and mental health, cardiovascular risk, disease risk. So HRV is a very real thing. It's not as strong though and as straightforward as VO2 max, which is to say, I will promise you, there is not a person on the planet that has a VO2 max of 10 that is healthy. There's no chance, right? But there are people with very low HRVs that are healthy.
And the inverse of high, so low R high HRV equals health, potentially. Even though you want your HRV ideally to be high.
Yeah, so this is where I was going with it. Low VO2 max is only bad. High VO2 max is only good. In fact, if you look at most of the research, it's going to tell you there is no diminishing returns with VO2 max in health. The higher that number gets, the more protective it is. The greater the risk of survival. It doesn't taper off. It doesn't law of diminishing returns. You don't see that at all. It doesn't even slow down. The higher that number, the more predictive. HRV is not the same thing. HRV is, the numbers work in the inverse. Generally, higher is better, right? Higher HRV is better. Okay, that's great. But you can be super low and be totally healthy. You can also have a high HRV and be completely unhealthy, be massively unhealthy. Additionally, if HRV gets too high, that's actually another predictor of poor health. So it's more of an inverted U there, where VO2 max is just like a straight line that goes up and up and up. And it's only somewhat tied to overall health because many factors go into it, some of which are not health related. They're just not. They're irrelevant to health. So it is a good predictor, but it would not be the best. We look at HRV in everybody, but I don't take action on it unless I see multiple confirmations that it's an issue, right? I will take action on VO2 no matter what. Like there's no other confounding factor I need to see outside of VO2 max. Go, yep, okay, this has got to go up. Unless you're like, oh, I was hurt that day, my ankle was hurting. You're like, okay, we can get a valid test. But if we have a valid number, I don't need to see anything else. With HRV, I need a lot more context. Okay, I need a lot more. How did you measure it? What device did you use? What time of day did you get it in? We need many, many days. I actually need like 30 days of data before I get too worried about it. Male, female, age changes, body weight changes, mental health, acute stress changes. Alcohol will typically cut it in half instantaneously or more. So it is way I need typically multiple things to go, okay, what is this really telling me?
So you mentioned alcohol cutting HRV in half. If we segue to lifestyle quickly, other than the basics, getting enough sleep, managing stress, proper nutrition, hydration, any of those, or is there something else I'm not thinking of which come to mind, which will have a positive impact on VO2 max in addition to, our protocol we just went over?
Yeah, there are many actually. Your actual fitness will be the primary marker that moves it up and down. If you are under a decent amount of stress, it might lower it a little bit that day. What it might do chronically is if that stress then influences your recovery and therefore training. So it's like a secondary or a tertiary effect rather than a direct impact on it itself. Nutrition can do it, but the biggest one that's going to influence it is body weight, body composition. So excess, and that's actually because of mathematics. So your VO2 max, if you're expressing it in relative terms, is divided by body weight. So the higher the body weight, the lower that number of VO2 max gets. But that's like a math thing. So that will have the biggest impact. But your overall fitness is the biggest one. The other ones, like you mentioned, sleep, nutrition, so on and so forth, are typically going to have secondary effects that compromise VO2 max rather than direct.
Interesting. Well, I think our audience got the memo on VO2 max. Uh, is there anything we didn't cover on the subject that you'd like to go over, or leave our audience with some words of wisdom, or let people know where they can find you before we go?
I could teach an entire semester on VO2 max. So yeah, there's probably much we left off there. I would think it might be helpful to summarize a little bit. Some of I think the most important take home points for most people is the fact that it is incredibly important. It is getting easier and easier and easier to test. It is not always affordable for everybody, but if you can scrape together a little bit of money, it's one of the most impactful and helpful things you could ever pay for to get tested. So it's worth the money. I can't say the same thing for wearables and trackers. Always like those are $300 to $400, and I can't always say like that's definitely going to help your life. I can tell you a one-time VO2 access will give you a ton of information in the short and long term. I would generally recommend getting it done once a year for ongoing tracking purposes as a good cadence. You can do more than that, but I generally wouldn't go much more than that if you can, regardless. And then the last part about it is you have a lot of play in it. So if the number comes back and you don't like it, you have a ton of wiggle room. You have a ton of say in that opportunity. And with what you do with it, you have flexibility. So you can make your protocol and your training program work to your lifestyle and limitations and things you hate personally, or physical limitations, injuries, equipment availability, all that. You have a lot of flexibility there. So that would be my final messages on VO2 Max.
Very empowering. Andy, thank you so much.
My pleasure, man.